In the scorching heat of northern Zubarah in 1857, people didn't gather by choice, they were dragged from their homes, marched under guard, and forced to witness a horror few would ever forget. In the dusty parade grounds of Naydari and the ancient city squares of Samboro, British colonial forces had perfected a spectacle of execution that was not only meant to kill but to shatter the spirit of a people. They called it blowing from the barrel, a cannon execution so gruesome, so absolute, that it erased not just the body, but the soul. The condemned were led to a massive field artillery piece, often a 9-pounder, and tied directly to its mouth. The British didn't hide the act. In fact, they prepared the ground like a theatre. Rows of chairs for colonial officers, crates for elevated viewings, and for the native people, chains and whips to keep them still. Governor-General Edward Whitmore, writing in a secret letter to a colonial ally, described it bluntly: "The spectacle is as terrible as it is instructive." Precisely the reaction we aim to produce in these rebellious territories. It wasn't justice. It was psychological warfare at its most grotesque. At the parade ground in Laoke, where dozens of these killings occurred, survivors remembered how the condemned were made to walk past the scattered body parts of previous victims, their blood still soaking into the dirt. The moment the cannon fired, the human body exploded into fragments, limbs flung across rooftops, bones shattered mid-air, organs rained across the field. The echoes didn't stop at the blast. They continued for days in the whispers of the living, in the terror-stricken silence of the streets. This barbaric method was not originally British. Centuries earlier, Persian invaders had used it. Even the royal court of Emperor Yaruba had once ordered it for high treason. But it was under British colonial control in Zubarah that it became systematic, a machine of state terror, refined, expanded, and weaponized. During the 1857 uprising, the British Empire's wrath knew no limits. In one single day, in Pesoro, 40 captured rebels were blown apart one by one each, spaced out by half an hour, forcing the onlookers to relive the nightmare with every fresh explosion. Lieutenant Colonel Alaric Stone, stationed at the end ridge, later wrote, "The body shattered into 1,000 bloody pieces, scattered beyond recognition. A man became a mist. Some fragments landed on the market walls, some on temple steps. It was as if even the gods were warned." But what made this punishment even more terrifying was its ritualistic pageantry. In Zulua, the executions were timed to take place on market day. Women carrying baskets of millet, children clutching their fathers' robes, all were corralled into makeshift galleries. They were forced to watch. Local attendance registers, now yellowed and fragile, show hundreds of names: mothers, merchants, priests who were obligated to stand and witness. Captain Samuel Ellis wrote in his journal, "Their faces turned pale, their bodies trembled." Good, that was the point. To make fear a currency. To make it travel farther than the cannon's blast. The trauma became generational. In the alleys of Samboro, mothers would hush their crying children with dark whispers of the demon barrel. And in folk poems, passed down orally, the tale of the Iron Beast became legend, an unholy monster that devoured men and spat their souls across the sky. One such poem was recorded by poet Ajani Sefu, who lived in the old quarter of Nandari during the occupation. "The city has become a death doesn't strike with a sword, now it arrives on wheels, roaring like the gods of thunder, ripping us apart with fire." From the rooftops, from the trees, from behind carts and pillars, people watched in horror. Even the earth seemed to mourn, quiet, motionless, sunstruck and soul-wounded. But the British weren't finished. In Kumba, they lined up 24 prisoners and executed them in just under 2 hours. No trial, no priest, no mourning, only the cannon and the blood. Colonel James Brannigan, in his report to Lord Coventry, wrote with cold pride, "The city grew quiet after that. There were no more songs, no more chants, only silence. It was the silence of control." And yet, something stirred beneath the fear. The colonial administration claimed it was a necessary deterrent. That fear was cheaper than mercy. Records even show financial discussions, each execution using only a quarter of the gunpowder of A regular cannon shot. Efficient terror. But beneath the horror, a seed was growing. A seed of memory, of rage, of unity. Revolutionary leader Malik Ekbanu, decades later, would write, "Every blast of that cannon burned something into our bones, not just pain, but a purpose." Their gunfire sowed the roots of rebellion. Songs emerged from the ashes, cries hidden in lullabies, resistance hidden in funeral chants. The people of Zubarah never forgot, because this wasn't just a killing method, it was a message. One written in shattered bodies and orphaned streets. A message that said, "We own your fear." But the people remembered more than the fear. They remembered the screams, the blood, the blast, and they remembered the ones who stood Tolivan as the iron mouth opened in the heart of colonial Zubarah. Execution was never simply about death. It was performance, a calculated show designed to crush not just the will of rebels, but the soul of an entire people. The cannon wasn't hidden in dungeons or back alleys. It stood in plain view, oiled, cleaned, and polished on the red dirt squares of cities, like Nadari Kumba and Samburu. It was more than a weapon. It was a stage prop, and the audience, thousands of black men, women, and children, dragged from their homes, held at gunpoint, forced to watch. Colonial officers like Captain Samuel Ellis treated these killings like state theater. In one of his journal entries, he even wrote, "It's not the death itself that does the work, it's the watching, the sound, the waiting, the trembling. That's what carves obedience into their minds." And carve it, they did. At the Kumba parade ground, executions were timed to clash with community rituals. Ceremonial days, harvest festivals, and clan weddings were deliberately disrupted so the cannon could take center stage. Locals began calling those days the Black Feasts, because the streets feasted on blood, not joy. The British authorities kept detailed attendance records. They knew how many came, who refused, who wept, who stayed silent. These weren't just events, they were data-gathering operations. In a report addressed to Governor General Edward Whitmore, an officer wrote proudly, "This week's executions drew 327 witnesses. Of these, 62 were children. The fear index is rising." They even graded fear. They turned trauma into policy. One of the most horrific tactics used by the British was the timed execution cycle. Instead of shooting all prisoners at once, they would space out the blasts one every 30 minutes. The people were not allowed to leave. They stood under the burning sun, listening to the same explosion over and over, each one echoing louder in their minds. In the city of Zulua, one man, Elder Tambo, later recounted to his grandchildren, "We didn't cry anymore. We just held our breath and waited. We counted the booms. Every boom meant another soul flying from the iron monster." Children began to draw pictures of cannons as demons. Mothers refused to name their sons after executed heroes, too afraid the spirits would follow. One child's diary, found decades later in a clay jar, included the line, "The white men don't kill people, they erase them. One second we see our uncle, next second he's smoke." And that was intentional. Colonial documents from the era reveal that British officials understood the cultural impact of body destruction. In many Zubaran spiritual traditions, proper burial is not just a ritual, it is salvation. To be denied a whole body is to be denied peace in the afterlife. And the British weaponized that belief. By blowing their victims into fragments unrecoverably, unburiable, they sent a message that went far beyond death. It said, "Even your gods cannot save you from us." Major Alistair Grant, an officer stationed in Samburu, wrote to his wife in England, "The effect is profound. These natives don't fear the sword, they fear what comes after. Our method denies them that." It's quite brilliant, actually. But it was more than brilliant. It was barbaric. In the town of Fayura, local folktales soon turned into whispered warnings. Children were told not to speak near cannons. Pregnant women avoided crossing the square, and the elders renamed the town Fountain, built from melted cannon fragments, the Well of Screams. And yet, despite this sea of horror, resistance never died. It merely went underground. Stories began to circulate of rebels who walked to the cannon laughing, of men who refused the blindfold, of women who cursed the British in their final breath. These stories became the underground scripture of a quiet rebellion. The colonialists had their cannons, but the people had memory. Even songs evolved. What were once tribal chants for rain or harvest now included lyrics about iron monsters, thunder, gods, and cursed white devils. One verse, recovered from the region of Makonda, read, "Let them tear the body, let them steal the flesh, but the soul flies higher than their smoke, and the land remembers." For every cannon fired, a new scar appeared on the landscape. But scars are strange things. They hurt, yes, but they also heal stronger. They remind, and as British officers clapped each other's backs for instilling discipline, the earth beneath them listened, the ground where the cannon stood, the trees that watched the blood fly, the children who turned their backs in silence. They remembered. They always remembered. In the Empire's twisted logic, fear was control. They believed that each blast from the iron cannon shattered not only a body, but also the will of those who watched. And for a time, it worked. In cities like Nadari, Zulua, and Fayera markets fell silent. Festivals were cancelled. Even temple bells stopped ringing. Fear became the rhythm of daily life. But fear, when pushed too far, begins to rot, and from that rot, something powerful began to grow. In the heart of Pesoro, where 40 rebels had been executed in a single day, people began gathering in secret, not to fight, not yet, but to remember. Mothers stitched the names of the dead into their shawls. Priests buried scorched soil in sacred ground. Farmers refused to plow the land where body fragments had landed. These quiet acts became rituals of defiance, born in the shadows of terror. In one underground school in Spro, a teacher named Abba Nkrumah taught history using ashes from the cannon square. She smeared the grey dust onto parchment and wrote the names of the fallen. She told her students, "When they erased our heroes, they left us the dust, and in the dust there is truth." The British had sought to erase hope, but in doing so, they ignited it. In the province of Makonda, an elder rebel named Duma Ekanu began secretly collecting cannon fragments. He smuggled them out in baskets of yam and buried them under village altars. Years later, when asked why, he said, "So the spirits know where to find the pieces." Meanwhile, in the colonial corridors of power, British officers congratulated themselves on maintaining peace. Colonel James Brannigan, the man who had ordered the 2-hour execution spree in Kumba, reported back to Governor General Edward Whitmore, "The people are subdued. The silence is perfect." But what Brannigan didn't understand was that silence does not mean surrender. Silence can be strategy. Silence can be memory taking root. By 1862, reports began to surface of rebel poems circulating in back alleys, ballads whispered in markets, lullabies sung to children that weren't just songs but coded stories. They didn't mention the cannon by name. They called it the Iron Lion, the Fire Breather, the Curse from the West. And in each version, the lion eventually fell. Revolutionary thinker Malik Ekanu, writing from exile in Namra, would later pen these words: "They fired their cannon to end us. But each blast planted something, a spark, a whisper, a rage. And it wasn't just poetry, it was politics." In the hidden courts of tribal alliances, leaders began reuniting. Old feuds dissolved. Warriors once divided by bloodlines now stood together under a common name, the kin of the shattered. They vowed to fight, not for land or gold, but for memory. For the ones who were blown apart and left unburied. The British never saw it coming because they mistook trauma for defeat. They thought that by denying burial, they denied dignity. But in Zubaron belief, to be remembered is to be resurrected. Even the cannon, their most feared weapon, began to lose its power. Children no longer ran from the sound, they stared at it. Old men spat near it. Women touched it, not in fear, but with defiance. In Ndari, one young boy was caught painting flowers onto its iron wheels. When whipped and asked why, he said, "So the next time it kills, it must roll over beauty." By 1870, colonial forces began to lower the frequency of public executions, not because of mercy but because the spectacle was backfiring. It no longer controlled, it inspired. At night, graffiti appeared on garrison walls. We remember the dust. Your cannon shouts, but our soil sings. One British administrator warned in a private memo, "This generation may be quiet, but the next will rise with fire in their blood," and rise they did. In 1898, in the village of Kasumo, descendants of cannon victims led the first successful siege on a British outpost. They weren't armed with muskets. They carried fragments shards of old cannons, passed down from grandparents, each shard engraved with a name, the name of someone erased. They called themselves the Children of Smoke. What the Empire failed to understand was that no weapon, no matter how loud, can silence a people who remember. The cannon had tried to erase the soul of Zubara, but the people had already learned the truth. The body may shatter, the name may burn, but memory marches forever. Far from the bloodstained squares of Zubara, across oceans and storms, the British Empire built another kind of hell, one not forged in fire, but in distance, isolation, and despair. They called it New Caldria, remote island prison colony surrounded by sharks, cliffs, and waters so cold they peeled skin from bone. It was punishment disguised as banishment. But in truth, it was a graveyard carved from living bodies. The year was 1788 when the first transport fleet arrived. 11 ships carrying 751 convicts, men and women sentenced not for violence or treason, but for stealing bread, resisting landlords, or simply being poor. The empire didn't need a reason. It needed labor, it needed land, and it needed a place where no one could hear the screams. The voyage itself was the first punishment. Locked below decks in airless holds, chained to wooden boards, the convicts of the Sea Seraphim ship were stacked like cargo. Rats feasted on their sores. Waste pulled around their ankles. Disease swept the hull before the coastline ever came into view. Surgeon Eli Harrow, who sailed on the notorious Wanderer in 1790, recorded this. The smell of the lower deck could slay a stallion. I have seen grown men cry without tears, their eyes too dry, their voices gone. Death travels here. As a shadow you can taste. One ship, the Harpy, lost nearly a third of its cargo before docking 158 corpses out of 500 to prisoners. The ship's master, Captain Donovan Crail, was charged with mass murder but acquitted. The official verdict, harsh but necessary transport. But those who survived would soon wish they hadn't. Because the land waiting for them wasn't salvation. It was Port Ensel, a penal fortress on a cold, jagged peninsula wrapped in ocean like a vice. The settlement had no escape, only punishment. Warden Thomas Greaves, the architect of its cruelty, believed in silence. He introduced the isolation doctrine, where prisoners were not just confined, but erased. Men were kept in solitary stone cells. For days, weeks, sometimes months, they wore leather masks called mutes during labor, preventing even accidental eye contact. They forgot what voices sounded like. One inmate, Daniel Carver, who spent 980 days in isolation, carved into his cell wall, "I don't know if I'm alive," or, "If this is what dead feels like, maybe silence is the afterlife." The prison chaplain Father Walter Hale warned in his 1841 report, "This method does not reform, it dissolves. I see men come in with hope and leave with madness, or not at all." But Port Ensel was merely the beginning. Across 1,000 miles of seasat, something worse, Grimshaw Island, a jagged black rock rising from the ocean like a broken tooth. Fewer than 3 square miles, surrounded by crashing waves and crimson mist. Here, the condemned weren't sent to serve time. They were sent to vanish. Warden Bartholomew Crane, ruling Grimshaw from 1829 to 1834, turned it into a factory of human ruin. Floggings were routine. Food was bait. Survival was barter. Convicts were worked until their backs split open, until their legs collapsed, until even their shadows looked broken. So brutal was the regime that convicts began drawing lots. To commit murder because being executed was preferable to staying alive. In one recorded case, 12 prisoners rolled dice to choose a victim. When the man was killed, the murderer surrendered immediately. His execution was his only escape. Even visiting officials were horrified. Governor Ralph McDowell, during a rare inspection, wrote, "This island is not a prison. It is a crucifix. They hang men here without ropes. Just time, hunger, and despair." Convicts chained in groups of 6 cleared land, waist-deep in leech-infested swamps. The irons rusted into their skin. Infections spread like wildfire. One surgeon, Dr. Harold Ventnor, noted in 1839, "Their legs rot while still walking. Flesh sloughs off like bark from trees. Those who fell behind, buried where they dropped." Punishments ranged from the sadistic to the unimaginable. The black boxer coffin-sized pit where men stood in the dark for days. The Treadhiller manual mill that forced prisoners to climb the equivalent of 6,000 feet a day. The spread crucifixion wooden frame that stretched a man's arms and legs taut while he was lashed to unconsciousness. In one case, convict Jasper Lowe received 100 lashes in one sitting. By lash 50, his back was skinless. By lash 100, the surgeon reported, "We were striking exposed muscle and vertebrae." And yet, through all of this, no riots came. No rebellions sparked, because even rage requires breath. And in New Caledonia, the Empire took even that. They controlled food, water, sleep, a pound of moldy bread. Salted meat, you couldn't chew. Watery broth, you prayed, had insects, because that meant protein. Some convicts turned to cannibalism. Others hunted rats and traded them like coins. William Takis, a shoemaker sentenced for petty theft, once wrote in a hidden journal, "A fat rat is worth 2 days' rations. A dead guard is worth a week's rest. A prayer is worth nothing." When rebellion finally came, it wasn't fire, it was famine. In 1844, when Commandant Joseph Childs reduced rations to force obedience, the prisoners snapped. They rioted using their iron pots as weapons. They killed 12 guards. The Empire responded with 26 executions. But even this didn't break the system. Because the British didn't want reform, they wanted ruin. They called it punishment, but what they built was a kingdom of ghosts, men without names, bones without graves, voices without echoes, and beneath it all, one truth howled like the wind across Grimshaw. This was never about justice, it was about conquest. Through suffering. At Port Ensel, death was never swift. It didn't come from a bullet, a blade, or a cannon. It came from silence and emptiness so deep it swallowed memory, stripped identity, and hollowed the soul. It was here that the separate system reached its most horrifying perfection. The theory was simple: isolate the prisoner. Deny him sound, deny him sight, and the man would break himself. Warden Thomas Greaves believed in this theory with religious devotion. In 1833, he ordered the construction of the Quiet Wing, a curved, windowless prison block with 68 solitary cells. Each cell was lined with sound-dampening stone. Every hinge was oiled, every footstep muffled. The walls themselves were angled. To prevent echoes, prisoners weren't called by name. They were assigned number-zerist identities. No voices, no conversations, no windows. And during exercise, they wore leather masks called beaks, shaped like blinders to block peripheral vision and muzzle speech. Reverend Victor Hale, the prison's chaplain, watched this experiment unfold and wrote in his journal, "They walk like ghosts, they speak in grunts." I baptized one man who no longer remembered his own language. One inmate, Robert Heron, spent 3 years in one of those cells. By the time he was released, he had lost the ability to write. His final diary entry read, "I can't remember what the sky looks like, or my mother's face. I whisper words, just to remember what sound is," and he was one of the lucky ones. Most didn't leave the Quiet Wing sane. Some pounded their heads against the walls until they bled. Others tore their own nails off just to feel pain. One inmate tried to eat the corner of his mattress, convinced it was bread. Dr. Harold Ventnor, who served as medical officer for 6 years, warned, "This is not reform. This is madness by design. A system that doesn't kill the man but deletes him." But Warden Greaves didn't care. In fact, he expanded the program by 1840. Grimshaw Island adopted the separate system in full. And it was there, surrounded by sea and fog, that the psychological warfare reached a new low. On Grimshaw, convicts in isolation weren't even allowed to stand upright. In the chambers of endurance, men were forced into narrow stone recesses, where they could neither lie down nor fully stand. They had to rest in twisted crouchers' bodies, cramping, minds unraveling. Prisoner Jonah Black, sentenced for stealing a silver ring, endured 17 days in one of these chambers. When he emerged, he screamed at birds in the sky and tried to crawl back inside. The guards called it breaking the bark. Once a man barked like a dog, they knew he wouldn't rise again. Others were subjected to the mirror room, a featureless box with polished walls where a prisoner was forced to stare at his own reflection for hours. No food, no water, just his own face. One man gouged out his eyes with a spoon. These were not punishments for crimes, they were punishments for existence. But perhaps the most feared of all was the prospread crucifixion, imported torture from the fields of Zubarah. For this new penal hell, a convict was stripped and stretched across a frame, arms and legs locked in place, spine arched. He was lashed until consciousness failed, then revived, then lashed again. In 1849, a man named Simon Wren was given 100 lashes this way. According to the surgeon's log, by the 50th stroke, his back had no skin. By the 100th, we were striking ribs. The frame dripped blood for hours after the flogger, Harlan Witt, took pride in his work. Known as the Devil's Arm, he could reportedly knock a man out in 3 lashes. He once said, "If they scream, they're still men. If they don't, they're beasts." And yet, through this nightmare, men tried to survive. In Sarah's Hollow, a temporary holding pen for new arrivals, prisoners carved messages into the stone with their teeth, their nails, broken spoons, even bone fragments. One wall still reads, "Tell them we were here." Even in absolute darkness, the human spirit scratched for proof of its existence. But not everyone endured. Records show that by 1845, nearly 1 in 3 prisoners at Port Ansell had lost the ability to speak. 1 in 5 attempted suicide. 1 in 10 succeeded. And those who didn't die or go mad became something else entirely, the hollowed, eyes vacant, backs twisted, minds still breathing, but no longer alive. These men were assigned to the death cruise convicts, deemed too broken for work, too fragile for isolation, but still needed for labor. They carried bodies, they dug graves, they buried their own cellmates. Sometimes, they buried the living, and no one stopped them, because no one cared to the empire. This wasn't failure, it was efficiency. They had found the perfect punishment, not one that ended life, but one that dragged it out until the soul dissolved. The punishment wasn't the lash, or the box, or the chain. It was the waiting, waiting in the dark, waiting for a name that would never be called, waiting to be remembered. But no one remembered, because the system didn't want memory, it wanted silence. Grimshaw didn't just punish the body, starved the soul, while the iron chains bruised skin and the cat-o'-nine-tails tore through flesh. It was the deliberate design of hopelessness that made Grimshaw a factory of despair. Here, men were not reformed, they were erased. Warden Bartholomew Crane, who ruled the island from 1829 to 1834, didn't believe in redemption. He once wrote in a classified memorandum, "The more a man begs to live, the more deserving he is of death. The silent ones die, like those they've already surrendered." And he made sure no man left unbroken. Inmates worked in Iron Man chains, sometimes 6 linked together at the ankles, forced to quarry stone for 12 hours a day under the blazing sun or freezing rain. The tools were blunt, the stones were sharp. The supervisors carried clubs, not words. One prisoner, Callum Drake, was caught whispering a prayer during work. He was flogged unconscious, revived, and made to finish the shift with torn muscle and broken ribs. Dr. Harold Ventnor, who documented the aftermath, wrote, "His back resembled raw bark, stripped from a tree, yet he still whispered, that terrified them more than the silence." At Black Rock Quarry, prisoners were made to carry granite slabs twice their weight. When they stumbled, they were beaten. If they collapsed, they were whipped. If they died, they were replaced. But it was the sea labor that broke most men. Every morning, convicts were marched into Bone Bay, where they were ordered to wade into chest-deep icy waters to chop down teakwood pine trees so tough they dulled steel in hours. The salt water chewed their wounds. The chains rusted into their skin. Infection was inevitable, and when it came, it smelled of rot and fear. In 1837, Dr. Ventnor filed a report to Colonial Command. "I have amputated 14 legs this month, not due to violence but rot. Their bodies are decaying while still conscious, still obedient, but the brutality didn't stop at the body. It attacked the spirit. The treadhill, a cruel invention of monotony, forced 16 men to climb wooden steps for hours going nowhere. Day after day, no breaks, no mercy. The distance climbed in a day was equal to a mountain. But there was no summit, no air, just sweat, blood, and the sound of bones grinding. One prisoner, Edwin Blackwell, finally collapsed and died after 7 days. He left a note scratched into the wall with his fingernail. God is not here, only stares. Yet for some, the body wasn't enough of a target. Crane understood the mind could be tortured more slowly. He commissioned the construction of the punishment box, a narrow wooden coffin where a man could not sit, lie down, or turn. Inside, it was pure darkness. No light, no time, no noise. Solomon Reeves, a man sentenced for helping slaves escape a sugar plantation, spent 22 days inside that box. When it was opened, he didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared at the floor until the guards dragged him back to the cells. The chaplain, Father Walter Hale, called the box a coffin for the soul. But if one punishment etched itself deepest into the bones of Grimshaw, it was the spread crucifixion, execution by inches. On a wooden frame, arms and legs pulled tight, the body offered like meat to be The lash fell again and again 5,100, sometimes 200 times. The most infamous case was Jasper Lowe, a former blacksmith caught leading a hunger strike. He was tied down, stripped bare, and lashed in front of 300 convicts. By the 80th stroke, he had gone still, not dead, just beyond pain, beyond sound. The guards called this the drift. When a man drifted, they said, he'd crossed into the realm where punishment couldn't reach. They flogged harder to drag him back. But Lowe never came back. His blood soaked the dirt. And from that dirt, resistance grew. Because the island wasn't just a place of pain. It became a crucible of revolt. Prisoners began forging alliances in the darkness. The chains that once separated them became signals rattled in rhythm, to warn or to summon. Secret codes passed in the form of scratches, coughs, even blinks. Then, in 1834, something happened that shook the empire. James Porter, a teacher-turned-forger, organized a bold escape from Sarah's Hollow. 10 men overpowered the guards, hijacked a half-finished schooner, and sailed over 1,000 miles through treacherous waters, eventually reaching the shores of Columbia del Sur, where they were granted asylum. Their escape became legend. The schooner's name, the Redemption. It sailed from hell, carrying ghosts who had refused to die. The British called it treason. But for the convicts who remained, it was something greater. It was proof that even on Grimshaw, where hope was buried under lashes, and Silencer Spark could still survive, on Grimshaw, the whip was just the beginning. The true punishment, the real sentence, was work. Endless, back-breaking labor, designed not for productivity, but for submission, to wear a man down until he forgot he was once free. The British Empire needed roads, bridges, barracks, and it built them not with stone, but with suffering. Between 1826 and 1836, the infamous Northridge Road was carved through 160 miles of jagged wilderness, connecting the coastal capital of Eaglenest to the remote highlands. But the hands that built it were not trained laborers. They were convicts in chains, each shackled to iron weighing up to 40 pounds. They used wooden mallets, chipped picks, and rusted spades. No machines, no animals, just flesh and willpower. Overseer Bram Moody, a brutal former army sergeant, ran the project like a battlefield. He shouted one rule: if you stop moving, you stop breathing. He meant it. Convicts who collapsed were left on the roadside. If they died, they were buried beneath the stones they failed to carry. If they lived, they were beaten and returned to the line. One of the few surviving records from this era scratched onto birch bark by a prisoner named Samuel Terredes. We built the road with blood, not mortar. The mountain took our breath. The empire took the rest. The road became a mass grave in disguise. Today, tourists drive it in air-conditioned cars, unaware their tires roll over thousands of unnamed dead. But roadwork was only part of the torment. On the shores of Devil's Reach, men were forced to drag iron carts filled with gravel up narrow switchbacks for hours. Each load weighed as much as a small horse. The chains around their ankles bit deep, rusting into infected wounds. The salt wind stung like acid. Dr. Harold Ventnor, the prison physician, wrote in 1839, "Their legs are no longer limbs, but black cords of pain. I see men walking on bones." Disease didn't stalk Grimshaw, it thrived. With poor nutrition, brutal schedules, and rotting clothing, convicts fell to scurvy, dysentery, typhoid, and an illness locals called ghost rotter, wasting sickness that turned the skin grey and the breath sweet with death at the Karoo Industrial Barracks. Originally designed for 100 men, over 500 convicts were crammed into its mouldy wooden halls. Fungal infections spread across their scalps. Their teeth fell out. Their ribs poked through the skin like cage bars. In the barracks' first year of operation, nearly 40% of the population died. The administrator's response: reduce rations further. Food itself was another battlefield. Each man received 1 pound of dried bread, 12 ounces of salted meadafon grain with mold and a ladle of watery soup. That was the day's meal. If the bread had worms, that was considered extra protein. William Rudd, a tailor sentenced for debt, wrote in a smuggled letter, "I watched men fight over rats. A fat rat was worth 2 meals. I saw a man trade his boots for a dead bird. Rations became currency. A boiled bone could buy you a day's rest. A handful of rice. A letter smuggled home. A fingernail file, maybe a shot at escape. But if you stole, you bled." The standard punishment for food theft was 50 lashes with the cat o' nine tails. A second offense, the black box, a coffin-sized chamber of pitch darkness, where men were kept for up to 30 days with only bread and water. Those who resisted often paid with their lives. In 1844, Warden Joseph Childs instituted collective starvation in response to minor sabotage. The result was the now infamous cooking pot uprising. Dozens of convicts, driven mad by hunger, stormed the kitchens with their own iron pots, wielding them like war hammers. 12 guards died. 26 convicts were hanged, and the food rations reduced again. Collapse from exhaustion was treated as laziness. Prisoners who fainted were dragged to the punishment cellar standing chamber, too narrow to sit, too short to lie down. The longest documented stay was 19 days. The man survived, but never spoke again. But the Propenbuyer didn't care about broken men, it cared about infrastructure. The sandstone government halls in Eagleness, the harbour fortresses, the iron bridges across the narrows of Greefall were built by these hands, these scars, this pain. Governor Lucan Macquarie's building program, between 1810 and 1821, consumed over 200,000 convict workdays. His diary entry from 1816 reads, "They say this is cruelty. I say this is empire. Greatness is never clean, and so the land was built with rope, with blood, with men too weak to speak. They were not workers, they were bricks, they were mortars, they were forgotten."